Hello, everybody. Can't see the people who I'm speaking to, but welcome and welcome everybody who's here in the room. My name is Julie Chamberlain. I'm an assistant professor in urban and inner city studies at the University of Winnipeg, and I'm co-lead of the Community-Based Research Training Center, very newly, just since the past couple of weeks, and I co-lead the center with Shauna McKinnon. And I'm here to welcome Molly McCracken, who's going to be speaking today about advisory committees in community-based research. And I want to start by acknowledging where we are physically meeting today. I'm not sure where everybody is joining us from over Zoom, but those of us who are here at the University of Winnipeg are meeting on Treaty 1 territory, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And we also get our water here in Winnipeg from Shoal Lake 40. And I make that acknowledgement, land acknowledgement at the beginning of this particular event because the colonization of this land and the attempt to erase Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples' ties to this land, also the exploitation of land and water for the benefit of some people and not for others, is really wrapped up with the history of research in this place. And in community-based research, we are interested in cultivating respectful, beneficial, reciprocal relationships through research process and through outcomes. And so we have a real responsibility to contribute to the struggle for decolonization, for restitution of loss and harm, and also to contribute to the struggle for an end to colonial violence, including an end to missing and murdered Indigenous women, two-spirited people, men and boys. And yeah, because community-based research requires attention and engagement to the specific place and communities that we're in relationship with, I wanted to start with this acknowledgement of where we are today. And so Molly McCracken is going to be talking to us today. She's the director of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Manitoba office. The Canadian Centre, the Manitoba office was founded in 1997, as I understand it, to support and publish collaborative, impactful, community-engaged research, critical and progressive policy analysis, and policy alternatives. And I'm going to let Molly McCracken say more about herself. But welcome, Molly, and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction and for the land acknowledgement in connection to the work of community-based research. I did want to note in the art here, the banner at the bottom is from artwork by Jackie Travers, who's a well-known and very accomplished artist from North End of Winnipeg, who's an activist as well. And we got permission to use her art for the State of the Inner City report. It's also on the Red River College building now, which is fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today about the role of advisory committees from my experience supporting community-based research. And just a little bit about the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. We are Canada's leading progressive research institute, active in Canada since 1980 and in Manitoba since 1997. And so we are a nonpartisan, charitable, independent research institute. And our research has taken the flavor of the community here in Manitoba, thanks to many research associates who are part of our work, like colleague Shauna McKinnon and Jim Silver, who's also connected with urban and inner city studies, and many more. And they helped start the State of the Inner City research, which is what I'm going to be talking about with you today. And I also wanted to note that I'm in my alma mater here at the University of Winnipeg. Urban and inner city studies did not exist when I was a student. I did sociology and women's studies, and then I went on to do a master's in public policy and administration. So I've always been interested in, from my time at UW, studying and understanding the problems of injustices and inequalities. And then I went on to do a master's degree to understand how the role of public policy could play in addressing those And then I'm very fortunate to be in my position with the CCPA in Manitoba now. So sometimes it's nice to share our stories, this, where we came from, where we've come to with students. So, you know, that's kind of where I landed, how I landed where I am right now. So how do I just make it go to the next?
If you click on it and then, yeah, try. Oh, that works.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our research and my experience in relation to advisory committees. I understand it's a topic that some people are interested in learning more about, so I'm going to share from my perspective what we've done on it. There's probably many ways to go about doing this, and so this is one way. And then, yeah, so talk a little bit about what are advisory committees, representativeness on advisory committees, some considerations in setting one up, some advantages to having an advisory committee and some challenges. What is the efficiency and effectiveness of an advisory committee, and some time for questions and discussion. So these are two reports that we've published that have advisory committees that I was involved in. So I thought I'd kind of tell the story of this research to help you understand a little bit. So the State of the Inner City report is a report we do every year. This is when we're on now, will be our 18th. And the goal is to walk alongside community development and community economic development in the inner city of Winnipeg, shine a light on strengths, and also talk about systemic barriers and challenges and what community organizations are doing to innovate, how they could get funding to do that. And at the time, this report, Forest for the Trees, Reducing Drug and Mental Health Harms in the Inner City of Winnipeg, we bring together a group of community-based organizations and leaders to talk about what are the problems they're seeing. And the meth crisis was of concern to people very greatly, as it still is to many people today. And so from that process, which I'll describe a little bit more in detail, we defined a research question and then assembled an advisory committee to advise on that research. And that advisory committee was very, very helpful. So there was a representative from the Manitoba Harm Reduction Network, a representative from Indigenous serving organizations, from a community health clinic, and from different, you know, frontline community-based groups on that committee to advise our researcher about how to go about, we had a general sense of the methodology, but how to go about doing that in a good way, and how actually helping us forge the relationships with participants, because they did interview people with lived experience of substance use and also different stakeholders. And then it was also very helpful, I'll talk for some other reasons. So that is one example of an advisory committee with State of the Inner City report. Now, some considerations that we have is we kind of are time constrained in our research. So you know, this cycle for State of the Inner City report has been once a year. And if you've been involved in research, that's not a lot of time from conception to completion. And so we are, when I talk about efficiency and effectiveness, that is part of how we're operating, because we're wanting to stay on people's radar with that report series. So if you have more time, I think you could do things even differently or more in depth than we do. And so that's great too. The other report that we had an advisory committee that came to mind is assisting renters, Manitoba's Rent Assist in the context of Canada's national housing strategy. So some folks might be familiar with Rent Assist. It's a program that was created in 2015 in response to community calls for an improved shelter benefit for people on social assistance. And so it's a very important example here in Manitoba of community advocacy actually resulting in policy change, whereby the government responded, the government of the day, to say, yes, we are going to develop Rent Assist. So if you're on social assistance, EIA, or welfare, your shelter, how much you get for housing goes up to 75% of the median market rate for housing as defined by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And every year it'll go up, which is great because often social assistance usually is not indexed to the cost of living, which is a huge problem. And so we got funding from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation through a partnership with the Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Association to study what is rent assist impact here in Manitoba, because it doesn't exist in other provinces, and particularly British Columbia was looking at rent assist. And it's being held up as a model across Canada, although it's not perfect, there's still problems, so that was done by Shana Plout, Sarah Cooper, and Jesse Hager. So our project partner was the Manitoba Nonprofit Housing Association, and then we assembled an advisory committee that had End Homelessness Winnipeg at the table, a representative from the newcomer community, New Journey Housing, that does a lot of work with people in housing, and also some community-based groups that help tenants directly, and the researchers. And so that was, they came together, and I'll talk a little bit about that process to advise on the methodology, kind of be a sounding board for some of the preliminary findings, the themes that were coming out of the interviews, and data that was being gathered, because there was data analysis of, so we got files from the Department of Families that we were able to analyze in that as well, and advise on the recommendations, what the drafts were looking like, how to frame the recommendations in a way that they could land the best with the public and be taken up by government. So, so there you go, some real world examples of advisory committees in research, local research here. So I just want to talk about our research process with the State of the Inner City that was developed before my time at Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and Sean McKinnon has written a whole book about community-based research, which I highly recommend reading. But this essentially is our process here, and it can be more iterative, but generally it is, the top bubble. We sit down, it's like a seminar style, open discussion, go around with community-based leaders of, women's centers, youth serving groups, renewal groups, youth surveying, Indigenous groups, to say what is going on, how are you doing, what are you seeing in the community, and how could research be helpful. And then from that, we have this conversation where themes do develop, and then we kind of workshop some ideas with them, and then we go away, and we have worked with Sarah Cooper, and we've worked with different researchers over the years, depending also on what the topics of interest are, and come back with some proposed questions for people. And then we kind of pitch an idea, it gets refined. We have, in fact, even voted on it, use different methods to kind of do that. And also sometimes it's more than we can do. So we say, okay, let's prioritize this, but maybe we'll try and do this another time, or connect with somebody else who's doing something similar, because we want to honor all those ideas. And then we have various mixed methods, ways of doing the research for the State of the Inner City. So we will do secondary document analysis, literature reviews. We'll look at statistics of neighborhood-based, neighborhood level census data, for example, and maybe any existing data that's in the community. But also we do primary data collection through interviews and focus groups. And we have done community events as well, community forums. So then you have to go through ethics, of course, to be able to talk with people, and we do that. So we have usually, when the methodology is being developed, I should probably have those bubbles both together, the methodology and the advisory committee. We say, okay, we would like to have an advisory committee on this. We kind of propose the methodology, but we also kind of have an idea of what we'd like to do. And I say we, because I'm often the project manager alongside the people who actually do the research. I'm not the one doing the actual research. And then we develop an advisory committee, and we also ask this larger group, who do you think should be on the advisory committee, and come up with some ideas of who. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about representativeness, but that's generally our approach. And then we do the research, and then we report back. So that's kind of the cycle there. So what is an advisory committee? So I kind of had to look up, and I found this lovely graphic, because you can get advice from various places, and you kind of have to let it percolate. So advice is guidance or recommendations offered with regard to prudent future action. And what is guidance? Guidance is, one definition is information aimed at resolving a problem or a difficulty, or I would say a question or questions. And what is prudent is, care and thought. So careful thought that this will go and be helpful in a good way, I would say. So this is generally our hope from having an advisory committee involved in the research. A group to walk alongside the researchers as they do the research to help guide it. So, I have experience in nonprofits, and maybe some of the folks out there do as well. So I thought maybe one of the questions might be, well, what's the difference between an advisory committee and a board of directors? Doesn't a board of directors serve a purpose, particularly where I'm standing, working at a research institute, I have a board of directors. So, this is kind of conceptually some things I looked up for this presentation and in my experience. So advisory committee are opportunities to bring in people from outside our organization to be involved, and that's very, very important for us as well. Particular expertise or knowledge or experience. Boards of directors, there's usually in the bylaws a proper process to bring in people through nominations and things like that. Advisory committees are time limited, connected to the particular project you're working on, whereas boards of directors are the legal entity of the nonprofit, so they're there as long as the nonprofit exists. I'd say they have accountability, but they have fairly limited accountability. It is advice. They're not the governing body responsible. The researchers have responsibility to uphold ethical standards and to the approvals they've received from the Human Research Ethics Committee or board to do the work. But they have, I would say, public accountability as much as folks know who's involved in that research. And then, of course, boards are legally accountable for the organization. Advisory committees are very close to the research process. They follow it along, whereas a board is kind of a high level governance. Even a working board might not always be super involved in a research project, but they would set the policies, parameters within which research would take place of an organization. An advisory committee has knowledge related to the research topic that's very, very important and needed to help that take place. And a board of directors may or may not have that knowledge, but they would have knowledge related to the mission and vision of the organization. And the advisory committee, they advise on the methods, the analysis, and the recommendations all the way along. Usually my board's not really that involved in research unless they're wearing two hats. They kind of set the parameters and then set us off to do our work. And then, we report along the way to them and they can ask questions, of course. And then advisory committees also celebrate the outputs and the results, and so do boards of directors. So they have that in common as supporting the work itself. So I'm going to talk about some concepts around a representative advisory committee, which is an important consideration for the advisory committees that we've set up. So, the composition is determined by some sort of formal connection, as in we want to make sure that we have an umbrella group whose area and expertise, like End Homelessness Winnipeg, for example, or the Canadian Community Economic Development Network, has a seat on the advisory committee, because it's very important that to their work and our organization that work, that line be made, that connection be made, or an informal connection through somebody who's shown a lot of interest and has particular knowledge that the researchers is important. And then to the communities, communities defined by different things like geographic or communities of identity, things like that. An advisory committee has to have a representation, then, they may feel they have an accountability back to the community or back to their organization that they're connected to. So there is some accountability there, but they're not elected usually, unless, well, we haven't been doing this because we don't operate in such a formal way, but I imagine you could have a group that says we want to choose this person and elects them, but normally it's not as formal as that. And I was kind of taking this because these structures are similar in some ways to governance structures used in Western societies of how our legislature or councils are created, which is people elect people to serve as a body that governs and moves forward with their mandate. So that's as far as I understand kind of some of the history of this. And I think it's important to name that and to be considerate of that also. But yeah, I'm not, that would probably be another conversation for another day. Some considerations for research advisory committees are to, you know, why are we putting this group together? What is the purpose of this group? And have some general sense of roles and responsibilities. You know, we'd like it if you would come to this many meetings, read the materials, you know, be available to do things along the way, things like that. To have very clear communication with the research advisory committee. So, you know, simply being organized, notice of meetings going out, minutes being taken, information and documents are put in a place that people can find, things like that. Being clear on, you know, what input do they want to have, what input we would like to have. Generally, people will not be reading all the transcripts, but they might be, you know, with the researchers, and we want to review some of the thematic materials that emerge, say, if you're doing focus groups and organizing people's feedback by theme. Because sometimes by getting in there, you might see things in a certain way. And involvement relies on trust. So, you know, building up that trust and that relationship with people on your advisory committee is really important. You know, saying what you're going to do and then doing what you say you're going to do, things like that are very, very important. So people feel that, yeah, their time is being well spent. And I should say, when we're putting these together, particularly when we're asking busy people who are wearing many hats, you know, often I will kind of sketch out, you know, generally I'm thinking the responsibilities will be something like this. We will sit down and propose to you what we're thinking, and you can give us feedback on the methods and how we're going to do this. Then they would give us feedback, and we'd send that back and get it to a final place. Then the research would start. And then if there's any issues that emerge, a meeting might be put together to say, you know, we're having trouble finding, we really want to find newcomers or newcomer youth in this particular neighborhood. We can't, nobody's answering our calls, or we can't, the contacts we thought we had aren't materializing. And then these are folks might say, oh, you know, I know someone who can help you, or have you thought of contacting this person? So kind of can help the researcher figure it out. And even if they can't figure it out, they might, just by having that conversation, find a solution or a way forward. Another important part in the research process is then, you know, a check-in midway through the research, and then once the raw data and the research data gathering is done, to kind of sit down with an advisory committee and say, oh, this is, we're done now. These are some of the preliminary findings or things we're thinking about, and they can kind of reflect and have a conversation about that. And then another time is when that goes away, the research go away, write it up, share a draft, and talk about it as well. And another time is on the recommendations phase. And then talking about when we're launching it, the knowledge mobilization, where it's going to go and how to get it out and where it will be useful. So I went off on a bit of a tangent, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the points along the way where we rely on the research advisory committees. A contribution of different types of expertise and knowledge. So recommending, you know, recognizing that there's different kinds of expertise, of lived experience, and different types of knowledge, and trying to make that represented where we can at an advisory committee. although there are limitations to this, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then, you know, they are helpful then if we're talking for reporting back to a larger group that, you know, they can also speak, well, you know, I was on the advisory committee and, you know, we did think about this, but we ran into these difficulties and we actually thought, you know, they can talk about piece of the thinking along the way of developing the research from various perspectives, other than just the researcher talking about that, which having more voices talk to the larger group can be helpful. So yeah, list of advantages. So this can be a visible and transparent connection to community interests. If people know, oh, so-and-so's on this advisory committee, oh, okay, they were involved, I know them, I know their experience. And it can also reflect the community and the interests of the community. The people on the advisory committee will have connections to different community networks, which can be quite helpful. You know, you're bringing a group of people along with you, and that's very helpful, and they can kind of help see things. Sometimes afterwards, somebody might say, why don't you do it this way? And they say, well, we thought about that, we talked about that, and it wasn't possible, or we thought we'd take this different approach. A way to, you know, help information, because I believe a group can tackle problems and find often more creative solutions than maybe one or two people. So having those group discussions and having a sounding board for, you know, how to present information, for example. A big one that I think is helpful in this and in any committee really is it's a chance to find consensus where there might be differences. And find a way forward where that might have been more difficult other ways. And yeah, you know, I think some of the examples on the Rent Assist project, for example, you know, different people had opinions about what was needed to improve Rent Assist. And so by having those conversations as a group, as the advisory committee, they kind of came to some consensus about what would be needed based on the research to propose solutions and options to improve Rent Assist, and that got into the report. Advising on knowledge mobilization, which is essentially how are we going to get the word out? Where do we go with this research? And it is a measure of legitimacy in the public eye that there was an advisory committee involved. Some of the challenges are the capacity to support participation in an advisory committee and making sure that people, you know, have an honorarium, childcare, bus tokens, there's, you know, lunches offered or meals or things like that. And if you are doing research, that you have the capacity to do it properly is important, because you want people to have a good experience being involved. Yeah, reduced engagement for those who serve out of duty more than interest. This is often an issue with any representative group, also boards of directors, that sometimes somebody gets named to be on something and they might not have, it might just be in their job description, and maybe they don't have any experience with that, but they're the one who's sent to do it. And so it can happen. And so, you know, I guess having those conversations with that person in that organization, if they're not participating a lot, to see what would be helpful there. But that is an issue in any representative advisory group or governing group. Potential to abdicate responsibility to formally consult, engage as much with broader community. So this was in some of the research I looked at to do this, and I think it speaks also, you know, and this is questions you'd have to think about when you're doing research is, so you have preliminary findings, you take them to the advisory committee. Do you want to also take those back to the community, or is it possible to take those back to the community? So those are all questions you'd have to figure out. And maybe there's ways to do both, to do a short summary back to the community, and have an opportunity to engage with that, but a fulsome discussion might be more possible at an advisory committee level. But I think that's a really important consideration in how you're doing research, especially with communities, is how do you get to the findings on the way to the end, final result, and how do you bring people along, and where you go to the bigger community and where you just have the advisory committee. Because the risk is you finalize something and some people aren't happy. And it's better to hear about that along the way than once it's done. And the risk of constituent rather than common interests. So that would be where, somebody's representing a group and they are really pushing for what their group needs and maybe not seeing the whole picture. Or they have, and they also have very legitimate concerns that they don't feel are being addressed. And so to be listening to what's behind all of that and figuring out what to do there. Efficiency and effectiveness, which is a term that we use a lot in my public admin training. Especially with anybody, you want to make sure their time's being used, and if people have a lot of things competing for their time, you want to make sure it's done well. So having compensation if the funding allows for that. And sometimes I think people are willing to participate if there's no, it depends on your resources, but there can be other ways to compensate people by recognition, or thank yous, or things like that if you don't have a big budget. And support to participate, support being, you could think creatively about what that would be, but, I talked about some practical things like food and bus tokens and things like that. Well-organized meetings, I talked about that a little bit more, and communications, and also making sure, how much do you want to hear from us? Because, some people might appreciate just having that expectation ahead of time, so they're not getting an email every day or something like that. Recognition and appreciation of people to make sure they feel, obviously, that their contributions were valued. Any training and support that you might be able to offer, and then a look back by the advisory committee on how they felt about their involvement. Something that I think would probably be a whole other session is working with circles of people who have lived experience as an advisory committee. We have had people with lived experience serve on advisory committees that we've got, that we've had, but they're often people who are very experienced volunteers who are very involved and are experts. It's not quite the same as a lived experience circle that might be new to serving in that role. And I think that would take a whole other workshop to talk about, but I just want to acknowledge the kind of limitations of what I'm talking about today. And that's also very important and valuable to do that. And I know a lot of research with people who've experienced homelessness, for example, has had these lived experience networks that's connected to the research project. So there's various ways that kind of group can interact and advise and be involved in research as well. Yes, so that's the end of my slide. Thank you, Miigwech Rasay, for your time. And this is my first time giving a hybrid conversation, so forgive me, I didn't always know where to look. Yeah, it's been a great opportunity to put this together. And yeah, if you are watching this in the future and want to reach out to me, it's molly@policyalternatives.ca, and I'm happy to answer or chat now and in the future.